Vanessa and I were married for 12 years, 7 months, and 11 days. Not that I counted every day. The number just stayed with me because it was printed on the final divorce decree that arrived in the mail 3 weeks after everything was over. Funny how a piece of paper can reduce more than a decade of your life to a few lines of legal language and a signature at the bottom. For most people who knew us, our marriage looked stable. Maybe not exciting, maybe not passionate, but stable. We lived in a 2-story brick house on the edge of Charlotte in a neighborhood full of people who mowed their lawns on Saturdays and waved politely when they checked the mail. We weren't rich. At least that's what everyone assumed, including Vanessa. Especially Vanessa. I worked long hours as an operations manager for a logistics company. At least that was the answer I gave when people asked what I did. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole story. Every morning I left the house at 7. Every evening I came home around 6. I drove the same silver pickup truck for nearly a decade. The driver's seat had a tear in the fabric. The air conditioner worked only when it felt like cooperating. And the passenger door had a dent from a grocery cart that neither of us ever bothered fixing. Vanessa hated that truck. She told me that more than once. She said successful men didn't drive vehicles that looked like construction equipment. I used to laugh when she said that. Not because it was funny, because arguing about it seemed pointless. Over time, I learned something about marriage. The arguments that matter are rarely the ones people have. They're usually the ones people avoid. The small disappointments, the unasked questions, the assumptions that quietly grow until they become facts in someone's mind. Looking back now, I think our marriage started breaking long before either of us realized it. Not because of cheating, not because of money, not because of some dramatic betrayal. It started breaking the moment we stopped being curious about each other. Or maybe the moment one of us did. Vanessa used to ask questions when we first met. Real questions. The kind that made you feel seen. What did you want to be when you were younger? What scared you? What made you happiest? Where did you see yourself in 10 years? I love those conversations. Back then, she listened carefully. Back then, she seemed interested in who I was. But people change. Or maybe they simply become more of who they've always been. Somewhere along the way, the question stopped. Years passed. And eventually our conversations became schedules, bills, groceries, appointments, things that needed fixing around the house, practical things, safe things, predictable things. One evening, about 4 years before the divorce, I remember sitting at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork. Vanessa walked past carrying laundry. She glanced at the documents, then stopped. "Who's David?" she asked. I looked up. "What?" She pointed toward the paperwork. "David Mercer." I smiled. "My first name." She laughed. Actually laughed. As if I had told a joke. "No, it isn't." "It is." She stared at me for a moment, then shook her head. "I've known you for years. Your name is Daniel." "My full name is David Daniel Mercer." She looked surprised. For maybe 3 seconds. Then she shrugged and walked away. That was it. No follow-up questions. No curiosity. No interest in why almost every legal document that came into our house was addressed to David Mercer. No interest in why business correspondents used that name. No interest in why certain financial statements arrived addressed to someone she claimed to know better than anyone. She simply moved on. At the time, I barely thought about it. Now I think about it often. Because that tiny moment explained more about our marriage than I understood then. A person doesn't have to know every secret about you. Marriage isn't an interrogation. But after 12 years, if someone discovers they don't even know your legal name and their reaction is indifference, something important has already disappeared. The truth was simple. My mother called me Daniel. Everyone else followed her lead. Teachers, friends, coworkers. Eventually, even I stopped correcting people. But every business I built used my legal name. Every contract, every property purchase, every corporate filing, every investment agreement, everything. Not because I was hiding anything, because that was the name on my driver's license, the name on my birth certificate, the name on every legal document I had ever signed. Vanessa saw those documents for years. She never paid attention. And that wasn't limited to paperwork. She didn't know the names of most of my clients. She didn't know which projects I cared about. She didn't know where I spent my lunch breaks. She didn't know I visited my father's grave every year on the same day. She didn't know I kept every birthday card my mother ever sent me. She didn't know I owned the old pocket watch my grandfather carried for 30 years. Not because I hid those things, because she never asked. And eventually I stopped volunteering answers. When people tell the story of a divorce, they usually look for a villain. Someone to blame. Someone to hate. Life isn't always that simple. The truth is usually quieter, more disappointing, more ordinary. Sometimes marriages don't collapse because of one terrible decision. Sometimes they collapse because two people slowly stop seeing each other. And one day they realize they've been living beside a stranger. By the time Vanessa filed for divorce, I already knew something important. She thought she knew everything about me. She thought 12 years had revealed the entire picture. She thought the man she was leaving was completely understood. What she didn't realize was that she had spent 12 years looking at only half the canvas. And very soon, that mistake was going to cost her more than she could imagine. Part 2. What the divorce took. The first time Vanessa mentioned divorce wasn't during an argument. It wasn't after some dramatic fight. There were no broken dishes, no screaming, no tears. Just a quiet Tuesday evening in October. I remember because I was replacing a section of fence behind the house when she walked outside carrying a glass of wine. The sun was setting. The air smelled like fresh-cut cedar. And she stood there watching me work for a few seconds before saying something that should have surprised me more than it did. Do you ever feel like you've settled? I looked up from the fence post. Settled for what? She shrugged. For life. I remember wiping sweat from my hands and studying her face. She wasn't really talking to me. Not the way people do when they're looking for an answer. She was talking out loud, trying to convince herself of something. I said, I think most people confuse peace with settling. She smiled politely. The kind of smile people use when they've already decided you're wrong. A few months later, she started spending more time away from home. Nothing dramatic at first. Girls' weekends, networking events, business dinners, trips with friends. The sort of things that sounded reasonable when explained one at a time. Looking back, the pattern seems obvious. At the time it didn't, because trust does something strange to your judgment. When you trust someone, your mind automatically fills gaps with innocent explanations. You don't investigate. You don't assume the worst. You believe the person standing beside you is standing beside you. That's how trust works. And that's why betrayal is usually discovered backward. The clues only become obvious after the truth is known. Around that same period, Vanessa became unusually interested in our finances. Not worried. Interested. There is a difference. She started asking questions she had never asked before. How much equity was in the house? How much was left on the mortgage? How much money was in our savings? How much were the cars worth? What were our retirement accounts worth? At first, I thought she was simply becoming more involved. For years, I had handled most of the financial planning. It seemed reasonable that she wanted to understand it better. So, I answered every question. I showed her statements, account balances, mortgage information, investment reports, everything she requested. She took notes. Actual notes. I remember teasing her about it one night. Planning a hostile takeover? I asked. She laughed. But something about the laugh felt forced. Not fake. Just delayed. Like someone reacting a second after the moment had passed. For 12 years, Vanessa had lived beside information she never bothered to understand. Now she was discovering that information had consequences. What kind of filings? I asked. She sounded frustrated. The way people sound when reality refuses to fit the story they've already told themselves. I found a commercial property. I said nothing. I found another one after that. Still nothing. And then I found a company. I let the silence stretch. Because sometimes people need room to hear themselves. Finally, she said it. Every document leads back to someone named David Mercer. I closed my eyes for a second. 12 years. 12 years of tax returns. Bank statements, insurance documents, business records. loan paperwork, closing documents, corporate reports. 12 years. And somehow we had arrived here. Vanessa, I said calmly. David Mercer is my name. The line went completely silent. I could almost hear her processing it, trying to fit the answer into the version of reality she had been carrying around for years. No, she said finally. Yes. Your name is Daniel. My name is David Daniel Mercer. Another silence. Longer this time. Then came the sentence that explained everything. I thought David was a relative. I laughed. Not cruelly. Not mockingly. Just out of pure disbelief. A relative. She thought the legal name on nearly every official document that entered our home belonged to a relative. The realization hit me harder than the divorce ever had. Because it wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It wasn't even about the marriage. It was about attention. Or the complete absence of it. Vanessa, I said carefully, do you remember the paperwork you signed when we refinanced the house? Yes. My name was on every page. She didn't answer. Do you remember our tax returns? Silence. The insurance policies? Silence again. The business filings? Nothing. I rubbed my forehead. Not because I was angry. Because I was suddenly tired. The kind of tired that comes when you finally understand something you've been trying not to understand for years. Eventually she spoke. Why didn't you tell me? I looked around my office. The walls were lined with framed photographs from projects completed over the last decade. Buildings, distribution centers, warehouses, expansion projects. Most people saw success as a sudden event, a breakthrough, a lucky break. The truth was usually much quieter. Success was paperwork, discipline, patience, thousands of boring decisions made correctly. The same was true of failure. Vanessa, I said softly, I did tell you. What? I told you every time you signed a document. Silence. I told you every time a statement came in the mail. More silence. I told you every time a tax return was filed. The silence became heavy. Because she knew I was right. The information had always been there. She simply never looked. Finally, she asked the question she had really called to ask. How much is there? There it was. The question beneath every other question. Not who. Not why. Not how. How much? I almost smiled. Some habits survive divorce. How much is what? The properties. The businesses. The investments. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. I turned my chair toward the window. Outside, workers were loading freight into trailers. A process I had watched thousands of times. Every shipment following a plan. Every destination predetermined long before the truck ever moved. Years ago, I had created a holding company using my legal name, David Mercer Holdings. Nothing secret about it. Nothing hidden. Everything properly documented. Perfectly legal. The company owned commercial properties, warehouse space, equipment leases, minority stakes in logistics operations. Assets accumulated slowly over more than a decade. Not through genius. Not through luck. Through consistency. And because those assets were structured correctly long before the marriage began, they had never become marital property. They weren't hidden. They weren't protected during the divorce because they didn't need protection. The law already knew exactly where they were. The only person who didn't was Vanessa. Enough, I said. What does that mean? It means enough. Her breathing changed. I could hear panic entering the conversation. Not loud panic. Quiet panic. The dangerous kind. The kind that arrives when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves isn't true. You knew this whole time? Of course. And you just let me walk away? I thought about that. Then answered honestly. No. She said nothing. You walked away yourself. The silence that followed lasted nearly 20 seconds. Finally, she spoke. And for the first time since the divorce began, there was no confidence left in her voice. No strategy. No calculation. No certainty. Only regret. And regret, I had learned, always arrives after the lesson. Never before it. Daniel. I closed my eyes. No, I said quietly. David. And on the other end of the line, she finally understood that she had spent 12 years married to a man she never truly bothered to know. Part 4. The truth she never wanted to hear. For almost 2 weeks after that phone call, I didn't hear from Vanessa. No messages. No emails. No late-night calls. Nothing. At first, I assumed the conversation had given her the closure she was looking for. Then I remembered something important. People rarely stop digging when they discover they've only seen part of the picture. They dig harder. And that's exactly what she did. The first indication came from Richard. My attorney called on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports. "You're getting attention," he said. "What kind of attention?" "The expensive kind." I leaned back in my chair. Apparently, Vanessa had hired a private financial investigator. Not because she thought I had hidden assets during the divorce. The settlement had already been reviewed by multiple attorneys and approved by the court. There was nothing to challenge. No fraud. No concealment. No missing paperwork. Everything had been disclosed exactly as required. The problem wasn't that information had been hidden. The problem was that she had ignored it. And now she was paying someone to explain what had been sitting in front of her for years. A week later, she called again. This time, there was no anger in her voice. No accusation. Just confusion. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." A small laugh escaped her. The first genuine laugh I had heard from her in over a year. Then she became serious again. "Why?" I knew immediately what she meant. Not why we divorced. Not why the assets existed. Why I had lived the way I did. "You'll have to be more specific." "I found one of the warehouse properties." I said nothing. "I found the lease agreements." Still nothing. "I found the revenue reports." She paused. "Daniel, you were making more money from one property than I thought we earned in an entire year." I looked around my office. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Vanessa had measured success by appearances. The car someone drove, the neighborhood they lived in, the clothes they wore, the vacations they posted online, the visible things, the performative things, the things designed to be noticed. The businesses I owned weren't designed to be noticed. They were designed to work. Warehouses don't care about appearances. Distribution contracts don't care about luxury cars. Revenue doesn't care about social media. The assets grew quietly because quiet things are often the most productive. "You want the truth?" I asked. "Yes." "The truth is I stopped caring about looking successful a long time ago." Silence. "My father cared about appearances." She didn't interrupt. "He bought things he couldn't afford." I stared out the window as memory surfaced. New trucks, expensive watches, credit card debt, constant stress, the need to impress people who never actually mattered. When he died, he owed more money than he owned. The line remained silent. I learned something from that. What? Looking rich and being rich are completely different things. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she asked something that surprised me. "Did you ever love me?" I closed my eyes. Some questions arrive years too late. Yes. The answer came immediately. Because it was true. I loved you very much. Then why does it feel like I never knew you? The question hung in the air between us. And for the first time since the divorce, I felt genuinely sad. Not angry. Not vindicated. Sad. Because there was no easy answer. Part of it was her. Part of it was me. Relationships rarely fail because only one person makes mistakes. "I think," I said carefully, "we stopped paying attention." She didn't respond. So I continued. "You stopped asking questions." The silence deepened. And I stopped volunteering answers. I thought about all the evenings we spent in the same room doing separate things. The dinners eaten while staring at phones. The conversations reduced to schedules and bills. The years that disappeared without either of us noticing. "You knew what I did." "Not really." "No." I sighed. "Not really." Another long pause followed. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I found the birthday cards." I frowned. "What birthday cards?" "The ones from your mother." My chest tightened. After the divorce, She had packed several boxes from the attic and placed them in storage.
Apparently, she had recently gone through them.
Inside one of the boxes were decades of cards my mother had written before she passed away. I hadn't realized they were missing. They were all signed to David. I smiled sadly. Yes. I sat there reading them for hours. I didn't know what to say. She continued. It felt like I was reading letters written to someone I'd never met. The words landed harder than she probably intended, because in many ways she was right. Not because I had lied. Not because I had hidden myself. Because over time she had stopped looking. And when people stop looking, they eventually stop seeing. Vanessa. Yeah. Can I tell you something? Okay. I looked out across the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set. Buildings reflected orange light across the glass. For a moment, everything seemed very still. You didn't lose your marriage because you left.
She didn't speak.
You lost it long before that. Silence. The days stopped being curious. The words weren't cruel. They weren't meant to hurt. They were simply true. And truth has a way of sounding harsh when it arrives late. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I heard her take a slow breath. The kind people take when they finally stop arguing with reality. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I think you're right. And for the first time since the divorce began, there was nothing left to fight about. Only understanding. The kind that arrives after everything important has already been lost. Part 5. The name she finally learned. The last time Vanessa called me was almost a year after our divorce became final. By then, life had moved forward in the quiet way life usually does. Not with dramatic breakthroughs. Not with cinematic moments. Just small improvements stacked one on top of another. The kind you barely notice until one day you look back and realize everything is different. I had expanded the business into 2 neighboring states. The warehouse operation had signed its largest contract to date. One of the investment properties had been refinanced under favorable terms. And for the first time in years, I wasn't spending my energy trying to hold together something that had already fallen apart.
I was at home when the call came.
Not the old house. Vanessa had eventually sold that 6 months after the divorce. The mortgage, property taxes, and maintenance costs had been more than she expected. People often underestimate how expensive ownership becomes when responsibility stops being shared. I had purchased a smaller place outside the city. Nothing flashy. A single-story home with a wide front porch and enough land for privacy. The kind of place where evenings felt quiet. The kind of place where nobody cared what kind of car you drove. The phone rang just after sunset. When I saw her name, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Hello. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something unexpected. I don't need anything. That caught me off guard. Most conversations after divorce eventually arrive at a request.
Advice.
Money. Help. Closure.
Something.
But her voice sounded different.
Calmer.
Older somehow. I just wanted to say something. I walked out onto the porch. The evening air was cool. A light breeze moved through the trees. I'm listening. She took a breath. Then another. As if she had rehearsed this conversation many times. I spent a long time being angry. I said nothing. At first I blamed you. The honesty surprised me. Then I blamed Derek. I leaned against the porch railing. She continued. Then I blamed the lawyers. A small laugh escaped her. Then I blamed bad luck. I smiled slightly.
That sounded about right.
People usually circle the truth before they're willing to walk directly toward it. And then, I asked. And then I ran out of people to blame. The words hung quietly between us. A year earlier, she never would have said something like that. Growth often sounds a lot like accountability. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that made me stop looking at the sunset. I finally understand what you meant. About what? Curiosity. I remained silent. I used to think knowing someone meant knowing facts.
She paused.
Their birthday.
Their job.
Their habits. The breeze moved softly through the trees. But that's not knowing someone.
No.
Another pause. Then she laughed softly. I was married to you for 12 years. I waited. And I never once asked why your mother called you Daniel when your first name was David. The sadness in her voice wasn't dramatic.
It was genuine.
The sadness of someone looking back and seeing opportunities they ignored. Questions they never asked. Moments they rushed past. I found one of her letters again last week. My chest tightened slightly. The letters had become part of several conversations over the past year. What did it say? She was quiet for a second. Then she answered. It said you were the kind of boy who noticed everything. I looked toward the darkening sky. That sounded exactly like my mother. She was probably right. She was. The conversation drifted into silence again. Not an uncomfortable silence. Just the kind that happens when there is finally nothing left to defend. No arguments. No accusations. No strategy. Only truth. Eventually she asked a question. Not about money. Not about business. Not about the divorce. A real question. The kind she used to ask years ago. Are you happy? I thought about it. The business. The home. The peace I felt when I woke up in the morning. The absence of constant tension. The feeling of no longer carrying something that wanted to collapse. And I thought about someone else. A woman named Claire. Someone I'd met 8 months earlier. Not because I was looking for a relationship. Life had simply placed us in the same room often enough for friendship to become something more. Claire knew my full name before our second conversation. Not because it mattered. Because she paid attention. She noticed things. Asked questions. Remembered answers. The small things. The important things. The things people often miss. Yes, I said honestly. I am. Vanessa was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. I'm glad. No bitterness. No jealousy. No resentment. Just sincerity. And somehow that was the moment I knew we were finally finished. Not because we hated each other. Because we no longer belonged to each other's future. Only to each other's past. A few minutes later we ended the call. No dramatic goodbye. No emotional speech. Just two people who had finally reached the end of a road. I sat on the porch long after the conversation ended. The stars slowly appearing overhead. The night settling around the house. And I found myself thinking about names. For most of my life people called me Daniel. Legally, I was David. Both names belonged to me. Both were real. But somewhere along the way, the story stopped being about a name. It had never really been about David Mercer. Or Daniel Mercer. It wasn't about hidden assets. Or businesses. Or property. It was about attention. About seeing people clearly. About asking questions before assumptions become conclusions. Vanessa thought she lost everything in the divorce. The house. The money. The future she imagined. But those weren't the biggest losses. The biggest loss was spending 12 years beside someone and never truly learning who they were. Because money can be earned again. Property can be replaced. Even broken lives can be rebuilt. But time is different. Time only moves one direction. And once it's gone, no amount of wealth can buy it back. I stood from the porch chair and headed inside. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from Claire. A simple message. How was your evening? I smiled. Because sometimes the most meaningful questions are also the simplest. And after everything that had happened, I had finally learned to appreciate people who cared enough to ask them.